So Mike, I think I'll pass it to you to get started.
Thank you. Thank you, Courtney. Thank you, folks. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Mike Grogan. I'm the CEO and president of Integral.org here in Calgary, but in this role, I am one of the network stewards of the Alberta Nonprofit Network. So on behalf of all the network stewards and the entire Alberta Nonprofit Network, thanks for taking the time out, especially on this day when things are a little bit in turmoil out there and we're all scrambling to figure out what the reality of the world is. I'm glad that you're taking some time to spend talking about data. And something that's certainly been a passion of mine throughout my career in the nonprofit sector. The Alberta Nonprofit Network is an informal group of organizations working to at least address, if not solve, some of the big challenges of this sector. So in workforce or government relations, value and impact, and most relevant today, data about this sector or data for this sector. So I am the co-chair of the Data Strategy Committee, Steering Committee, along with my counterpart, Robin Blackadar, PolicyWise, who can't be with us today. But thank you for being here. The data strategy work is a continuation of work that's come a long way in the last probably 5 or 10 years in the sector. From the, if anybody who's worked in this sector knows that data about the sector is really challenging to get. Data for organizations to use is sometimes there, but sometimes not in forms we can use it. So this work has a number of roots. It started with some folks, even Jeff Braun, when he was at CCBO, I remember gathering folks to do the first stage of this work where we received some funding to lay out a roadmap, what a data strategy would look like for the sector, and then shifted next into PolicyWise, and then taking the lead on implementing some different parts of that data world for us. So the Data Strategy Committee, our mandate is to build a coordinated system and to leverage capacity to align a long-term vision to build a knowledge-driven nonprofit sector. And we do a number of things in that area. How to use existing data that's out there in decision making, and that's probably a focus of some of our work today. The creation of new data and mobilizing that data, and then finding a centralized support for some of this data, and how do you put that in a place where we can all use it. So again, thanks for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to Matt, who's going to walk us through all things data today.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Mike. So I'm excited to talk to such a great group of individuals today. We have people that really cross the sector, some people in support roles, some people actually directly in the non-for-profit sector, different organization sizes. We could see that in the registration. This presentation will be recorded today, so if you do want to go back, you want to share it with someone else, someone couldn't come today with the newest measures coming out, please let us know, and we'll give you a chance to basically get back to you on those links and where to see the presentation. So let's get into things today. So first of all, to move on, this data strategy is actually a partnership between various organizations. So the two big groups, Alberta Nonprofit Network and PolicyWise, are two big partners here, as well as funding support was provided by the Edmonton Community Foundation, PolicyWise for Children and Families, and the Government of Alberta. So we just want to thank them up front for our support in this work. In terms of today, so we do have lots of things that we're working on in this Alberta Non-for-Profit Data Strategy. Today, we're really focusing on one survey, the Canadian Survey on Business Conditions. And the reason we're doing this is because this is one of those priorities that was set through engagement, where people wanted to learn more about data that could be used on the sector that could help with COVID-19 pandemic recovery, which is definitely a very relevant theme to today with the recent measures. So to support with this, so if you're going to look here and you're just looking at the screen, you'll see 2021 instead of the second quarter 2021. The Q3 data was just released at the end of August from Statistics Canada. So, because I know this is one of our goals and I want to make sure you have the most timely, most recent data, today will also include some of that third quarter data. It is mostly based on the second quarter, but most of those general findings that I just put up there are actually similar findings to what we're seeing right now. And then when there is a difference, there's a positive trend, anything like that, I'm actually going to bring those up and talk about those today so you can see where are things moving right now in terms of the most recent data. Also, breaking my rules, with presentations, I have a rule that I say I'm not going to change anything in my presentation 48 hours before. That totally doesn't make sense to me today because we did have new measures. So I will comment a little bit on those. Not meant to be a deep conversation or anything like that, but as a person who does serve as a vice president on a volunteer non-for-profit himself, and some of those thoughts and things that we've gone through as we think about those new measures, just to make sure, because yes, this is data and we want to know data about the sector, but really what is the sector? It's our communities, it's our individuals, it's those people we're supporting. And that real story is also an important thing to include as we talk about anything around the Alberta Nonprofit Data Strategy. Finally, I will say one thing at the end. We will give you a chance, we'll give you some time as well to make some responses on a survey. This survey will have things around future engagement with you if you are interested, as well if you do have some of those things that you want to say about context, how you are experiencing things, any of your thoughts on these recent measures, shoot those out to us, include those, put those down, because we want to hear your stories and we want to use that as we move forward to continue to support the non-for-profit sector. So starting out, I'd like to just do a traditional territories acknowledgement. So first of all, I'll say that Policy-Wise for Children and Families acknowledges that the land in which we are located is Treaty 6 territory, a traditional meeting ground and home for many Indigenous peoples, including the Nehewak, the Niitsitapi, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Denasulana, and Anishinaabe, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our communities. We respect the treaty that was made. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. This is very important to us and how we approach data as we move forward. Okay. So now I'm going to start to talk about the survey today. So it does say Q2, so I will introduce that Q2 Canadian Survey on Business Conditions, what it is, some of that contents, how to think about the data, also introducing some of the bigger contexts when I look at other types of data. In this section, I'll also briefly talk about those recent measures because I think they're really important to just say up front, because this is the reality. Things are changing. We have a COVID-19 pandemic. Things are going to move here back and forth. And as we think about data and recovery, we also have to think about that dynamic nature. So what is the Canadian Survey on Business Conditions? So it's across Canada, Statistics Canada cross-sectional survey. So that's a mouthful. One thing to think is it's across Canada. And it also tries to serve by having lots of different groups that it's surveying here. So if you were to actually go to the website and look at the Canadian Survey on Business Conditions, you might actually struggle to find the community non-for-profit sector. Because when we're talking about cross-sectional, they're saying we're looking across different types of businesses and we're surveying there. So this is really on one line of that whole survey. So if you're interested in other sectors, you can look there, see them. But it's really on the community non-for-profit portion of the survey. In terms of what it consists of, it's voluntary, so it will have some bias as always, but they do try to stratify, so they try to have different breakdowns, random sample, get a good sort of survey across those different types of businesses and non-for-profits by geography, so across the provinces, different areas, rural, urban, industry sector, subsector, and size of those organizations. So as always, Statistics Canada has really great measures about thinking about those things, and I will talk about those, and I do think this is one of those ones where they did survey pretty well, as best as we can. This one, the Q2 survey, was collected in the spring in April to May 6, 2020, so pretty recent. And furthermore, the newest data is really recent. The third quarter is July 2nd to August 6th. So really, in terms of surveys, getting analysis to be useful and everything, that's about the quickest you can do it in terms of getting a nice survey and a sampling there. In terms of who is covered and we're focusing on today, that's the community non-for-profits. So when you look at Statistics Canada data, what do they call it? They'll call it non-for-profit institutions serving households. So if you look at those and you're trying to find it there, you may not see community non-for-profits. They may label it in the text as they describe it, but really it's this line here. The data that we talk about today is cross Canada. It isn't just specific to Alberta. But that's because, so if you look at the survey, about 1,400 community non-for-profits were surveyed and 102 were from Alberta. So if you're really looking at that data quality and everything, going down to that 100 is going to give some limitations, especially with specific items. So by going up to that bigger one, we still get that good data quality, but we also note that in general, the patterns are pretty similar in Alberta. In terms of the groups that are being represented in this data, basically we have different types of subsectors. So we have arts and recreation as the biggest, health and social subsectors, information cultural, rental and housing, accommodation, and then other services. So they tried to really get across some of those different categories. I will note that these categories aren't probably the normal ones if you work with a lot of non-for-profit sector data, but these are the standards used in Stats Canada. Also, I will note that these two, health and social and arts and recreation, being big ones, is an important pattern that we would expect if we were looking at this type of data. So it is showing that they're trying to get different types of subsectors into the survey. In terms of employees, there is a little bit more of the smaller organizations that are being sampled, 1 to 4, 5 to 19, and still quite a big portion of those bigger ones. In terms of what we would expect if we were looking at the whole sector, looking at previous surveys, we would expect that there would be more in these smaller organizations. In fact, this is probably, there would be even more than what we're seeing here. And one big group that is missed in here is non-for-profits without employees. So we expect about 50% or more that would actually be non-for-profits without any employees at all. They aren't covered in the survey, so this is a limitation if you're looking at and you're thinking about the whole community non-for-profit sector. However, I think it's appropriate because when you look at this data and the questions that are served to come at businesses, a lot of them, if not a majority of them, would not be answerable to those other organizations. So, in terms of age of organization, most of the groups tend to be more established, more than 20 years. And once again, this is what we'd expect looking at the non-for-profit sector data in general. Finally, a cool thing is they do survey both rural and urban, and they have a good chunk in rural organizations. So once again, you do have that coverage of different types of groups. Okay, and just the last thought before we go into, so you've seen some of that stuff. What I would say is, first of all, what to do when you think about these findings. First of all, interpret the findings with cautions because they do miss some of those aspects of the community not-for-profit sector. It does miss some of those smaller groups. They're not being represented. But it is great initial evidence if you're going forward to think about the community not-for-profit sector. Think about some of those issues that are there. And if you apply them to your context, use them to strategically move and think about the future. What not to do? Don't think they're the whole non-for-profit sector, just reiterating on that first point. And if you do discuss them, I suggest discussing them with some context about how the data was collected. Also considering that things might be changing right now as we move into this fourth wave. So just on that, and like I said, I think it would be irresponsible not to talk about the current context right now. Really looking at hospitalizations and how things are going with the COVID-19 pandemic right now in Alberta, I'd say it has been acknowledged that we are in a fourth wave and measures are being made for that. These measures will impact us. If you haven't reviewed them, I do suggest you do more in depth, but the synopsis is there are a lot of stricter measures that are proposed. However, unlike previous sort of waves, this time actually has a specific program where they call the restrictions exemption program, where a lot of these stricter measures may not apply if you follow certain types of specific things in your non-for-profit. For example, if you have individuals over 12 and over, proof of vaccination, medical exemption, tests for COVID can actually be ways that if you systematically do them in your organization, you can remain open without measures. So it's a different sort of wave where I'd be like, maybe with the current pattern, we could say where things are going to go next. This may change how things are changing for non-for-profits in the future. And just as an example, like I said, I am on the board on a non-for-profit. We had practice today. We're a sports and recreation volunteer non-for-profit, and we had to have a board meeting last night, basically. What happened and what's happened with our organization? So basically during this pandemic, we've been here, but with the recent waves, basically we've been keeping afloat through rent subsidies, membership donations, despite a lot of shutdowns. This summer, things were starting to move up, and we're starting to rebuild in terms of our savings and ability to move forward. But with these measures, we know we will have to make changes that will affect our membership. However, the conclusion, at least in our group, is they seem to be more manageable as a sports and recreation group. However, they will probably lead to some change in membership and some loss that will affect us in the long term. So really, I'm not trying to push us out here as a great example or anything like that, but I wanted to say up front, before we get into the data, this pandemic is evolving, it is changing. So are our stories as non-for-profit organizations, as communities, as individuals being supported. And that's really important that we keep in mind as we move forward. It's not just data, it's about people and moving forward in a way to support us all. Okay. So that's the context. Sorry, I spent a lot of time on there. So let's talk about the data and let's see what the trends are that have been reported in the Q2 and the Q3 data and how they look together. First of all, we'll briefly chat about organizational outlook. Then we'll talk a little bit about some of the employee outlook in terms of how changes are expected. And then finally finish off by discussing a little bit on the COVID-19 pandemic past measures and some of those learnings. And some of those future measures that organizations are considering right now. So what about this organizational outlook? So for the next 12 months in the Q2, 86% of organizations were saying that they were optimistic about the future. So I talked to a few groups about this, and they said, well, non-for-profits are pretty optimistic anyway, but you know, that's the truth. They are optimistic and all that, but actually they're becoming even more optimistic right now in the Q3, and it is increasing as things move forward. As we look at the next data, I would say perhaps this optimism is not unfounded as we look at some of the patterns that they're reporting. For example, when we look at reported and expected income and expenses over the next 3 months, basically organizations were saying that their income was decreasing still, although a lot were not changing, more decrease than increase. And also expenses were increasing, so a very bad combination. So when we look at across the pandemic and what's been reported in the survey, decreased incomes have been definitely a reoccurring theme. And this shift towards operating expenses going up is actually a more recent theme in terms of the data. So once again, this might be evidence that things are ramping up as we move back. And a positive pattern is basically, so looking at Q3, looking at that operating income, this is the first time in the pandemic, so looking at the data where more groups than not are saying that we're having an increase in their income at this point in the Q3. So once again, maybe that optimism is founded, although you have to always go back to the reality that there are measures, there are things that will be changing as we move forward. Also, in the survey, basically, they have them report on how long do they think they can continue to operate before bankruptcy. So in these organizations, basically a majority said that they think they can operate at least 6 months, so a very significant amount of time. And this pattern is still showing in the Q3, although actually in the Q3, there's more groups saying that they have more unknown and unclarity about their future operations, perhaps as things were evolving for the pandemic. Finally, another thing that was reported in terms of organizational outlook was talking about obstacles for the next 3 months. So in the Q2, the big obstacles that really came up were things related to the workforce. So about getting employees, that was a big thing that came up. About getting those clients to make sure that they have their customers and they're getting their services out to individuals. And things related to financial issues in terms of rising costs, debts, all those things. And then finally, a big one was government regulations and bans. I'm happy, I'm not happy to report this first, but in terms of the workforce in Q3, we're actually finding this is becoming a slightly bigger obstacle that people are reporting more in the non-for-profit sector, although very similar numbers, whereas all of the other three are actually being less of an obstacle and an issue in terms of this quarter, as well as government regulations, although maybe that one is going to go back up now that there are measures. Okay, the next thing they talked about in this survey was things more specific to employee outlook in terms of how things are going. So we do know that getting new employees and recruiting them is one issue that was reported. How about the stability of those employees? So reporting on the next months in terms of the number of employees, most groups actually said they didn't expect much for change, but for the groups that did, more groups were reporting increases to decreases. This is a similar pattern that's actually gotten even more positive in the Q3, with more groups actually shifting towards increase than decreases. Finally, similar to that bankruptcy measure, basically, when they're talking about how long people thought they could operate before laying off staff, once again, a majority of those organizations said that they thought that they could operate at least 6 months. This was a similar pattern, or is a similar pattern in the Q3. Although once again, like bankruptcy, there's more organizations reporting uncertainty and unknown as a value for this one. Okay, so as the last part, I'd like to briefly talk about some of the COVID-specific findings in terms of the survey. So there was ones that were related to past measures in terms of development opportunities, how people use resources and funds, as well as some of those future measures that are coming up. So one thing, first of all, that did happen in the COVID-19 pandemic is a lot of organizations shifted towards virtual services. So they came out, they realized because they couldn't meet their clients sometimes in person, they tried to do things online, work with them, and often this helped to keep people in touch. I've definitely heard that in the projects I've worked on with more specific agencies. But another cool thing that did come up in terms of conversation was actually organizations saying they were using these virtual services to reach new clients and partners. So this is a really positive pattern that 32% said they actually were reaching new clients. In terms of what types of clients they were reaching, that was, first of all, it was existing markets was a big one. So existing domestic and markets and international markets. As well as more focus on domestic markets. But one surprise finding, and I've definitely heard this from a few organizations, is also groups saying they went online. So they got those services and they realized that when they were providing, they were actually coming into touch with families that were abroad that wanted to support their loved ones. They were coming into touch with people that were international that wanted to take the program and it wasn't in their neighborhood. So we are also seeing, or we also saw in the pandemic that quite a few groups, not as many, that were also reaching international markets that were new in terms of their virtual services. So once again, a benefit there. In terms of sources of funding that were used in terms of the pandemic, they were asked about what groups used. 31% said they didn't use any. So a majority said that they were getting some sort of funding to support their organization. The big ones that came out were the Canadian Emergency Wage Subsidy, the Canadian Emergency Business Account, provincial supports, provincial, territory, and municipal supports, and temporary wage subsidies. One surprise one to me that was a little bit lower was actually the Canadian Emergency Rent Subsidy. As a sports and recreation group, This was actually literally the one that saved us from having to shut down in terms of this, because we just had rent space that we couldn't use and we had to pay for it, and it was in contract. So things like this, there were some that came there, but there's also barriers and things that did come across. In terms of those barriers, well, they did poll those groups that said they weren't funded to get a sense of what they were saying in terms of those funding. Actually, a majority of those that weren't funded said they didn't need it, 67%. And then they talked about eligibility, different sorts of things that go there as a much smaller amount. However, one thing that I'll just point out that seems to be missing here is in terms of those funded, what about those groups? Were there groups that didn't get enough in terms of what they needed for the funding there? Were there barriers for those things with those? And that might be a different thing for groups that are actively seeking that type of funding. But we don't have the data, so I can't see more. Sorry. In terms of measures that groups are using post-pandemic, so one thing they are discussing is sort of those differences and changes in terms of how people work. So a majority of organizations, 61%, are saying they're going to have employees come back on site in the second quarter. And then some groups were talking about sort of teleworking, shift work measures to change how people are working. In terms of coping with other things with this online environment, there also is discussion about using more of different types of training to make sure that their staff keep up to date, especially online. Finally, a last aspect that does come into play is because people are teleworking, or moving back to the office. The question is when they move back, or if they're teleworking, are they changing those spaces? And that was definitely something that came up with a lot of organizations as well. So this is the second quarter. In the third quarter, they did expand further on this. So they said, okay, what about those individuals that are anticipating, or those organizations that are anticipating to telework? Well, in the third quarter, we still had about 69% that said basically no teleworking. In terms of the type of teleworking, in terms of the percentage of groups that are actually going to come back or are going to telework, it was really polarized, with 12% saying 100% in terms of the rest, and 13% being on the smaller end, with more in the middle in terms of those intermediate strategies. So we're really seeing differences as people move forward in terms of how they approach that teleworking. In response to the teleworking, also, they did ask a follow-up question for those groups that are planning to telework in terms of what groups plan to do to sort of strategize with it. And in a proportion, although small, 10%, said they also plan to shrink their office space in response to correspond for those changes. Okay, and then the last thing I'm going to talk about was something I didn't plan to talk about, but it really came up because it is one of those potential measures that did come up in terms of what's happening for Alberta right now. Is they did also talk about COVID-19 rapid testing. So COVID-19 rapid testing, I did look into the evidence. I'm not quite sure about those details. I'm not going to comment too much on that, but the recommendation with COVID-19 rapid testing is, of course, if you do have that positive, that you would still go in and you would still have a PCR test to follow up to make sure a person has COVID. But it's a fast way for people and organizations to get a sense if a person might have COVID as they're moving forward and to screen for those things. It's really a screening tool as far as I can tell. So about 6% of organizations said they were implementing COVID testing at this time, with about the same in terms of ones that were planning on doing it for the next steps. And those groups that weren't actually implementing it or planning it, about 55% said they didn't need it. And a little bit surprising to me, about 45% said they were thinking that they wanted to do it. But there were a lot of barriers in terms of cost, awareness, difficulties procuring. I did see that there are programs around getting some of those, but there are ongoing costs and expenses, especially for those small non-for-profits. For example, our non-for-profit that I work on, this is not really an option for us to pay for because we really don't get the money for it. So we could not support this. Okay, So to finish up, I just want to do a few little teasers so you can look at it, because this is the non-for-profit data strategy. I want to make sure you guys have a chance to look at other data sources and to go on and to really think about those and maybe look at those. So first of all, not really a teaser because it is today, but the full second quarter analysis is up on our website if you want to see more. It has more details. It also has an infographic if you want to share it, all of that stuff. So I do recommend looking there because I didn't present everything today because I didn't want to overwhelm you with tons of content. And I wanted to give you more timely data with the quarter 3. The other thing I would recommend is we do have the registered charity analysis up on our website that you might be interested in. This is more looking at that economic workforce impact across the sectors, subsectors, across regions. So we spent a lot of time working with the registered charity data. First of all, we broke it down into community non-for-profit registered charities. So it is more related to this sector. So looking at this, a few teasers, $7.3 billion in estimated value in 2018, about 48,000 full-time jobs being created in this sector. $1.9 billion in spending from social services. We also break it down by other subsectors. If you're interested in those other ones, you can start to look through that in this analysis. And we did look at regions, and one pattern we definitely saw was there was more per capita spending in those urban regions versus those rural regions. So if you're interested, go ahead, look at this one. I suggest it's a good source. Other ones that we do have coming out, so that third quarter analysis, I'm just finishing it up and we plan to release that soon. There is a satellite account for non-for-profit analysis that I'm working on, once again, Statistics Canada, where they have really intimate data from across the non-for-profit sector, so it's not just registered charity data. Also, we'll have diversity analyses, things for different parts of the non-for-profit sector. So this one could be really interesting if you're looking at the full impact of the whole non-for-profit sector. And And then finally, we'll also be trying to get that fourth quarter analysis out this year as soon as possible, perhaps early next year in terms of timelines. So that one is looking probably late December, early January is when that would be available. And of course, I keep on tweeting our horse as policy-wise. No, that's not true. There's lots of different groups that are working out there and doing really great work. One group that I'd like to highlight here as very recent data is Imagine Canada. And their sector monitor analysis, they do these regularly, has some really great data in terms of that uneven impact and really good policy analysis on the not-for-profit sector. And they do some good survey methods as well. So I would say if you want to know some more detailed analysis about specific things and thoughts about recovery, this is a really great analysis to go into that. It's unfortunately not possible with the Stats Canada data due to privacy laws of Stats Canada. So really, this is one, if you want to get into some of those things as it comes up, this is a great chance. Just a teaser, some things they talk about. They talk about the fact that we're having what we'd expect with a recession, basically a K-shaped recovery where some groups are doing really well, some aren't. They talk about that more in the report. Another thing is they're finding some groups that weren't able to strategize, weren't able to get the resources, are actually finding that demand is bigger than their capacity right now. And the last thing they really point out, which really strikes home to me as a recreation sector group, is one group that was hit particularly strongly is the arts and recreation subsector, because they really had to shut down a lot of those activities. They're really just not possible. We tried to, it became online, and it really changed what we could do to provide a service. Okay. So the last thing before we go in and I give you a chance for questions, I want to give a few minutes. So I'm going to give you about, I'll give you till 11:45. So we have a survey online. Courtney's going to pop that into the chat link. I'd like you to, if you have a moment, look through this. Basically, the things that I'll talk about is if you want to join certain aspects of future data activities, data strategy activities, then we can contact you. If you want the webinar recording link, we can make sure we get that to you. If you're interested in sharing context on the findings and some of your thoughts, this is also a great point and a chance to do that. We will be thinking about those. So please do, if you do have the time, just go through it and write a few comments. So I'm actually going to pause for about until 45 after, and then we'll start again. If you need to complete afterwards, that's okay. But we do really appreciate your thoughts and comments, because you are the sector, you're people working with the non-for-profit sector, and it's very important to hear your context and your stories.